One of the largest petroleum servicing companies and one of the most active and vocal members of the sort of climate denial community, if you will, Koch Industries, doesn't even sell stock. They're a privately held company, family company. So you can't divest from them because you can't own them. So they're not going to be impacted by this effort. So then the argument is, well, it's not about hurting their bottom line, it's about revoking their social license to operate. Okay? But at one level, fossil fuel companies don't have a social license to operate. Social license to operate comes out of the corporate social responsibility movement, and it essentially boils down to corporate reputation. Every year, the Pew Research Group does a survey of Americans about the top 25 industries in the country, and every year, fossil fuel ends up dead last, just below its government, unfortunately. In terms of people disliking fossil fuels, there's about a 61% disapproval rating of the fossil fuel industry. So they don't really have much of a social license to operate, but more importantly, what they have is they have an actual license to operate. They have the legal power to do what they're doing. And they are constrained to some extent by legal power, and they are allowed by legal power to pollute the environment. And I think ultimately that is where all our tactical strategy has to incorporate a recognition of the fact that, as far as I see it, the only force ultimately that's strong enough to euthanize the fossil fuel industry is government power that can regulate it out of existence. So then the question for our movements is how do we get to that? And I think there's a role for divestment in that. I'm not opposed to divestment. I was just worried that it was taking something of a superficial approach. That changed, and as I said, the 350 activists were really big about how they took this criticism. Okay, now here's a criticism of my position. You can say, all right, granted, divestment is purely symbolic. It's not actually attacking fossil fuels industry's bottom line or their infrastructure, the way, say, fighting Keystone XL or fighting fracking or fighting mountaintop removal attacks the infrastructure of the current itself. And 350.org is intimately and robustly involved in those struggles as well. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. So okay, so divestment is a symbolic strategy, but symbolic strategies actually have been placed. Were the lunch counter sit-ins in the South during segregation, did they help bring the white power structure in the South to its economic needs? No. They were highly symbolic. They were very material. People were using their bodies to disrupt business as usual. But ultimately what happened is they created those sit-ins and all of the various tactics of the civil rights movement created a moral spectacle that reached an international stage. And it got in the way of John F. Kennedy's battle against global communism. And it became very hard for representatives of U.S. state power to go around the planet talking about freedom when there were images of black people being attacked by police dogs. And thus the federal government stepped in and forced the locals to change how they did things such as. And this, I think, is ultimately one of the crucial ways forward at this moment. We have a political deadlock in our country. We can't expect any kind of meaningful and robust legislation to come out of Congress. But here's the good news. We actually have the means to attack this problem at a really a national scale and therefore a global scale, because we're still the largest economy in the world. There is, huge amounts of money ready to be invested. We have the technology, wind, solar, hydropower, and we have the walls at the national level. There is corporate America is sitting on more uninvested cash than at any time since 1956. If it got proper cues from government, a lot of that cash could go into building out clean industry. The federal government itself could help jumpstart this, not with new programs and loans, but simply through clean purchasing. More than 1/3 of the U.S. economy is the public sector. This is not counting duplicate money that the feds give to the state. This is a point that anti-government right-wingers make great hay of. Grover Norquist always brings up the fact that the federal government is 25% of the national GDP. And progressives, liberals, environmentalists frequently shy away from this. Don't respond. To my mind, that's actually part of the solution. Wait a minute. If more than 1/3 of the U.S. economy is, in theory, accountable to the citizenry, why aren't we demanding that the government, the public sector, consume clean energy, buy electric vehicles? The post office has 140,000 vehicles that the average would travel 18 miles a day and park in the same place every night. There's no reason that fleet couldn't be electrified. Same with all these university fleets. If institutions started consuming clean power, it would help create economies of scale for the clean tech sector. And this gets back to this question of investment versus consumption. Investment is important, but really what clean energy producers and clean tech producers need right now, more than investments alone, is they need customers. This has to do in part with the fact that natural gas has come online from fracking and blown energy markets, blown the floor out of energy markets. Energy prices are dropping, and that means that commercial scale utilities are canceling wind projects. Numerous major wind turbine producers have gone into bankruptcy. Some of that has to do with cheap competition from China, but some of it has to do with the fact that energy from gas is so cheap. It's also displacing coal, but it's making it harder for the clean energy buildup. What that means is the clean tech sector needs customers. The public sector and institutions that are accountable, like Brown University, could play a very important role in helping to build out those markets by being consumers of clean energy. So this gets at this, the special role of institutions, and that gets us to the question of green power. Utilities are in an important position in all this. And under Jim Rogers, Duke Energy could have been a leader in moving towards clean energy, but unfortunately, it hasn't been. I don't know what his position on divestment is. I assume he's going to say, don't divest because these companies need the space and the money to innovate. The utility firms, energy firms, they're the ones that are really going to lead the way. Except that his didn't. He oversaw a $32 billion merger with Progress Energy, and making him the largest Duke, the second largest utility in the country. The core area of this business, there are 7 million members who get the majority of their energy from coal-fired power plants. Duke, it might have changed in the last year, but until through 2012, sourced 25% of its coal from Appalachian mountaintop and rural source coal. I mean, just the worst way you could actually bring in coal. Duke Energy is a member of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which pushes at the state level for deregulation, pushes a whole sort of right-wing agenda, anti-union, anti-regulation, school privatization, but it involves pushing to undermine renewable portfolio standards at the state level, and these are state laws that require utilities that are going to sell electricity in their markets to increase the amount of energy that comes from carbon-neutral sources. So Duke, indirectly, by its membership in ALEC, has pushed against the kinds of regulations that would actually help create the clean energy revolution. And ultimately, this anti-government pro-carbon agenda are intimately linked and have to be recognized as such. Duke's currently, for its core power users, supplies 0.2% of the electricity from carbon-neutral renewable sources. The goal for 2032, when Jim Rogers was CEO, was to boost that amount to 2.5%. That's not leadership. And institutions have a very special and important role. And so in the divestment struggle, I think actors should think about what are the secondary demands that leverage the special responsibility of institutions. And reinvestment, ultimately, the boundaries of that question should go beyond the equity markets. And we should really think about what are the concrete impacts that will be made by reinvestment. What can be done with all these buildings? Buildings consume 75% of electricity in the U.S. They're responsible for 38% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Universities are, if nothing else, a bunch of buildings that are being heated and cooled, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to be done around these questions. I don't have all the answers, but those are my suggestions. That's a reversal of the critique I made, the critique of the critique I made, and I hope that makes sense and is useful for those of you who are involved in the divestment campaign. Thank you.
Really glad to see all of y'all here today. Look forward to talking to you about this subject. But I think it's very important, especially in the context of Christian's comments, that I set the stage by telling you where I come from. You can probably guess with my accent, but to tell you what our position is as a company. We're the largest utility in the United States. We're headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're either number 2 or number 3 in the consumption of coal and natural gas, as well as in the production of electricity from nuclear. We're the 5th largest generator of renewable energies from wind and solar. We are predominantly a seller and have an extensive network over 10 states of renewable energy. Personally, if you go back to 2009, Bill knows this, because I was one of the few advocates in Washington supporting the Waxman-Markey bill to endorse and embrace cap and trade, putting a price on carbon, putting a cap on emissions so that we could plan for the future. Because the power sector is the most capital-intensive industry in the world. The power industry builds power plants that last 40 years. So we have to look into the future. We have to look around the corner. We have to try to gauge what makes sense to build for the future. And I should say, in the last 5 years, we've spent $9 billion on new generation, predominantly gas-fired generation. And as a consequence of that, we are shutting down 90 old coal and oil units that are high-emitting and inefficient. We are modernizing our system for the future with an eye toward a price on carbon, even without any regulation in place, because smart businesses try to see the future and make investments to reflect what is coming in the future. So I think it's very important to have a clear vision of the future and to prepare for what's coming, even though it might not be the law today. When you got up this morning, you threw the switch to turn the light on, or you turned on your coffee machine or heated water for tea. How many of you thought, I wonder where that electricity is coming from? How many of you thought that this morning when you woke up and you threw the switch? You didn't, because electricity is back of mind. When you go buy a gallon of gas, do you know what you pay per gallon? Raise your hand if you do. When you pay your electric, do you know how much you pay per kilowatt hour for electricity? Raise your hand if you do. Not so many. And so it's important to understand where your electricity comes from, but it's important to understand what you pay. Now, I would say, let's talk about coal divestiture as a policy. I would pose the question how effective it will be. Christian's written a really good article that says, in the Huffington Post, that basically makes the case, of in itself, it will not be very effective. Because there are a lot of other things that are going on that's going to shape usage. So let me talk about the other things so we don't have to put in context how valuable this will be at the end of the day. It in terms of changing behaviors in the United States. Changing behaviors of people who throw the switch. Changing behaviors of utility companies that are building new generation. Change the behavior of coal companies when they don't sell it to the United States, they sell it to Germany, they sell it to China. Will it change behaviors? First of all, the most effective thing in this country to reduce coal use has been the discovery of shale gas. It has been the greatest innovation, technological innovation in the last decade. Prior to then, over 50% of electricity in this country comes from coal. Today, only 37% comes from coal, and that's not the result of regulation. That's not the result of divestiture policy. That's the result of technological development of an independent gas producer, not a major oil company, being tough, using government technology, repurposing the technology, and has allowed us to become rich with a 100-year supply of natural gas. And as a consequence of this shale gas discovery and utilization, think about this time. Our carbon emissions are back to where they were in 1992. We've almost achieved the Kyoto Protocol objective, and yet we have significantly more people than we did in this country in 1992, and our GDP is much larger, and yet we've achieved that through technological development. So a key to having a low carbon economy is to be able to invest in technology and utilize the technology. So we've made progress, and guess what? In Washington, where I spent a lot of time, and I'm going after our meeting today, in Washington, shale gas broke the paradigm because everybody in Washington argued the cleaner the fuel, the higher the cost. And what shale gas did, it says it's cleaner, but it has a lower price than coal. For today, we're dispatching natural gas before we dispatch coal. And that's why there's been such a significant reduction in the emissions of CO2 in this country. Now, gas is not a perfect fuel. It's a bridge fuel. It has 50% of the carbon footprint. Most environmentalists argue, convert from coal to gas. But at the end of the day, gas has 50% of the carbon footprint of coal. We ultimately are going to have to find a way to capture the carbon in natural gas if we continue to use it throughout this century. Then the question is, where is the coal going? It's not being used in the United States. It's being shipped to China. It's being shipped to Germany. And we can have a conversation about Germany because it's leading the world in the build out of renewables. But they've shut down their nuclear and are shutting it down. And they are shutting down their gas plants, and they're building more coal plants to complement their wind and solar. And while the U.S. has reduced its emissions of CO2, Germany, which is held up as a paradigm of greatness with respect to renewables, they're actually seeing an increase in CO2 emissions, notwithstanding tripling their utility rates as they build out this renewable infrastructure in Germany. One other important point, we have to have a macro view. Climate change is not a U.S. issue, it's a global issue. And I would say as the coal goes to China, there's a lot of criticism of China because there's an important fact here. Between now and 2030, more than 80% of carbon emissions in this country will come from developing countries. But China is a wonderful example. It's a good example and a bad example. It's a good example because they have lifted over 400 million people from poverty by giving them access to electricity. That's the first step in lifting people from poverty. And no country in the history of the world has been able to do what China has done. Now they build a coal plant every week to do it. And now we have to clean it up, and they will clean it up in my judgment. But it shows you the linkage between access to electricity and lifting people from poverty and building the middle class. The last thing I will say is, you sit here on the East Coast. and a lot of environmental policy comes from the East and West Coast. I just want to take a moment and say there is something between Providence and LA. And what is there is a part of our country where 25 states have more than 50% of electricity come from coal. You say, well, why did they do that? Well, part of it is they did it by thinking of the government policy going back to 1978. I looked at this room and I'm probably the only person here that remembers 1978. Just clearly. Because in 78, we came out with Arab oil embargo, and what happened? Our industry, about 20% of our electricity came from oil. The government said, wean yourself from oil. They then passed a law that said it's against the law to burn natural gas because it's a premium fuel. You can't burn it to generate electricity. No oil, no gas. And then what they said, build nuclear, build coal, we want to be energy independent. And so the people across the country who had access to coal, and in the South, where we had no gas, no coal, we built nuclear. 50% of our electricity in the Carolinas comes from nuclear because you built what made sense. And that's another important thing to keep in mind as you craft policy. This is a geography question. Where you live and your access to fuels determines your position. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, if you're from West Virginia, you support the coal industry because it is so critical to the economy of the state. So I think it's very important. These issues are tough, but you have to have a nuanced, insightful view to be effective. Now, let me conclude by saying I have dealt with this issue. And I want to say something to you. I believe in having a portfolio of fuels that generate electricity. I believe we should have some coal, we should have gas, we should have nuclear, we should have renewables. In the fifth fuel, energy efficiency, that should be an important investment that we make. Because unlike the car industry that's totally dependent on oil, we have multiple ways to generate electricity. And keeping that, you hear President Obama go all of the above. And all of the above is important because we don't know what technology is going to be developed to allow us to use coal in an environmentally responsible way. We don't know what technology is going to develop to allow us to extract CO2 from coal or natural gas. We don't know about the new small modular reactors that are being tested or the new nuclear plants that are being built in China as they lead the world in the production of solar panels and wind turbines. We do not know. So having a portfolio, as in diversification of your assets and a portfolio you manage of your resources, is very critical. So I would say taking anything out of the portfolio is a mistake and reduces your flexibility over the long term. Now let me share my experience. I'm blessed and have the good fortune to serve on the International Board of the Nature Conservancy. I also serve on their finance committee. And I had this very issue presented to us: should we have a policy with respect to the divestiture of coal from our portfolio consistent with our purpose going forward? First of all, when you're a portfolio manager for a university or for an organization like the Nature Conservancy, your first responsibility is to preserve and grow the principle for the future of the university or the organization that you are representing. So you have a deep fiduciary duty. So we struggled with this. We came up with this policy, and we did adopt the policy. And the policy it says we would make no investment in any company where more than 5% of their revenues or their income comes from the sale of coal, production and sale of coal. We went a step further and said we will not invest in any utility with plans to build a new coal plant, given the current technological capability to extract carbon from coal plants. And that to me sounds like a reasoned approach to address the issue and was consistent with our mission. And it's an incremental approach at some level, but it recognizes something, and this is the last thought I'll leave with. When you think about energy issues, when you think about managing a portfolio, when you think about the energy infrastructure of our country, you must embrace cathedral thinking. What is that? I'll give you one example. I recently took my granddaughter to Paris, and we were at Notre Dame, and had a guide and telling us the history. But when you look at how that was built over 100 years, the architect who drew the plans never saw it finished. The people who worked on the foundation their entire life never saw the walls or the stained glass windows. Those that worked on the walls and stained glass windows never saw the spires. And even those that saw it finished never saw all the prayers, the weddings, the funerals, the experiences of the people there for hundreds of years afterwards. Yet 4 generations dedicated their life to building this. They had vision, they had faith, and they had a belief that what they were doing in their life would make a difference, not just today, but for future generations. So as you think about these issues, employ cathedral thinking and think about the implications, not just for you, but for future generations. Thank y'all very much.
We have Bill McKibben.
Thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today, but let me begin by saying that in a certain way this debate should be unnecessary. For the last several years, students here at Brown have pursued divestment of coal. That is a moderate request, far more moderate than the one that 350 has made for total fossil fuel investment. A more aggressive demand that's already been met by colleges across the country, cities from Seattle to Providence, and major religious denominations. Here, students have gone carefully through the appointed bureaucratic system, and the advisory committee on investments has strongly recommended divestment. In the past, this recommendation has always been followed, but in this case, the administration has twice asked for clarification as if this was a problem where urgency was not paramount. But urgency will be the watchword of my remarks. In fact, apologies if I seem to be speaking too quickly. I've got a lot to get through. I salute the students who have made this issue real here at Brown, and wish one of them had been allowed to join us up on the stage, but I'll do my best to explain why their request makes both practical sense and is morally urgent. Point 1, coal is gruesome. Its direct health effects are enormous. The first study we have of fossil fuel deaths worldwide, which came out last September, estimates that there will be 100 million deaths from fossil fuel by 2030, the vast bulk of them from coal. This damage is, of course, concentrated among the poorest people who live near power plants, but it affects us all. If you want to know why you can't eat fish from lakes in New England, it's because of the pollution coming out of the top of smokestacks in places like Duke. Point 2, the greater danger it presents is to our climate. Last Friday's report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made it clear that we cannot burn the vast majority of coal that companies on this divestment list and their bill plan to burn if we are to grapple successfully with climate change. Jim Hansen, our most important climatologist, has repeatedly shown why we must be out of the business of burning coal by 2030 to have any hope of stabilizing the climate. That calls for immediate, powerful action. So far, we have melted the Arctic, or at least 80% of its summer sea ice. So far, we've taken the Atlantic here and every other ocean on Earth and made it 30% more acidic. So far, we've taken the planet out of the Holocene by raising the temperature a degree. As the IPCC made clear, without emergency action, that 1 degree could be 3 or 4 degrees before the youngest people in this room are our age. This is by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done, and preventing it requires not just normal effort, but maximal effort. And fast. 4 decades from now, the cathedral is going to be underwater. Okay? Point 3, the fossil fuel companies and utilities are not moving with anything like the required speed. They're on their own timeline trying to maximize profit. Duke is a good example. Even in the years after the last 3 IPCC reports made it clear the danger we were in, Duke decided to go ahead and build new coal-fired power plants. It lags behind its 11 peer utilities in getting off coal. It has the most modest plans for renewable energy. Its integrated resource plan released last year shows that by 2030, when Jim Hansen said we need to be off coal altogether, about 2.25% of power in North Carolina in its service district will come from wind and sun. This is absurd. We talked about the coasts. I mean, as far as on my map, North Carolina is just as much on the coast as Rhode Island. And in fact, the Department of Energy has estimated that some of the probably best wind resources in the country are off the coast of North Carolina and will be sufficient to meet 100% of the state's needs. An independent study conducted by Ventyx, a consulting firm, found that Duke could be off coal entirely by 2020 by investing aggressively in wind, sun, and conservation. What would the net cost to ratepayers be? They'd save $108 billion, or 57% of their bills. That's in contrast with the Duke of today, which has just asked for a rate increase to cover the cost of its new plan. Mr. Rogers deserves great credit for his rhetoric, but not for his actions. That's why the national, that radical magazine, Business Week, called him a smooth-talking king of coal. This is really important that we get this right. Point 4, we could be getting it right much more quickly, fast enough to matter. Here's what Citigroup said recently. Citigroup, again, not exactly a radical source. What is clear to us is that the perception of solar is inefficient, is no longer accurate, a fact that is not being fully appreciated by the utility sector. In our view, as we clearly show solar is already cheaper in many countries, with others very close behind, including the United States, with several states showing socket or retail parity, and they cited Georgia, Arizona, and New Mexico, countries not concentrated along the coast. In fact, we could go much farther. The University of Delaware study in January of this year found that 90% of the grid could be powered by solar and wind by 2030, and it would halve the cost of electricity for consumers. The Delaware team created a computer model that tested 28 billion combinations of renewables, energy sources, and storage mechanisms. Sure, and it stripped away all subsidies for renewable energy. They found that we could provide 99.9% of demand by 2030 with no increase in cost at all. Instead, Mr. Rogers offers us the promise of shale gas, which indeed is increasing. The trouble is that it's not a rich fuel. The trouble is that as we reduce carbon emissions in this country, we are clearly increasing methane emissions at an enormous rate. Today, the news from today is that the latest IPCC data shows that methane is 25% more potent in trapping heat than we had thought even a year ago. And so the damage in the calculation gets worse and worse. Point 5, coal-fired utilities are doing their best to prevent dramatic change like this because they fear the effect on our bottom line. Business Week again, there are 3,200 utilities that make up the U.S. electric grid. It's a model that's changed little since Thomas Edison invented the light bulb and is doomed to obsolescence. What they don't like is the distributed generation, decentralized, homegrown green energy, because the Business Week says it poses a mortal threat to their profit model. And so the industry is fighting back. They're trying to roll back net metering. The battle in Arizona is particularly intense right now. And in other ways, hinder the transition to new sources of power. Mr. Rogers, for instance, was on the board of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce until he was terminated out in 2010. During his tenure, the Chamber not only fought all attempts to do anything about climate change, but it filed a brief with the EPA insisting that it would be all right if the temperature warmed dramatically because humans would, quote, adapt their physiology and behavior to the new climate. Duke Energy, as Christian says, belongs to Allen, which is busy fighting the classification of coal ash as hazardous waste. Duke has some of the biggest piles of coal ash on the planet. Duke belongs to the Electricity Reliability Coordinating Council, which is even filed the mercury rule, the most basic pollution rules. 2 weeks ago, the EPA took a very modest step towards regulating carbon from coal-fired power plants, and they were immediately denounced by Duke for doing it. They want the old world to hang on longer, far longer than science tells us it can. Point 6, divestment is an effective way to fight this kind of abuse and to speed up action. Normally, we would turn to things like shareholder activism. For 25 years, this has been ineffective. In place after place, it has not produced change at the speed with which that change needs to go. The reason is that there's not a flaw in the business plan of these industries. The flaw is the business plan. The business plan that calls for only 2 or 3% solar and wind generation at Duke, say, by 2030. So on occasion, divestment, severing ties, making a profound moral statement is required. Brown has done this on a couple of occasions, South Africa being maybe the prominent example. And in that case, it was enormously effective. Not, as Christian points out, by going straight to the bottom line. We cannot bankrupt Exxon or Duke or anybody else. Our goal is to politically bankrupt them, to have some effect. Remember when Nelson Mandela got out of prison, the first trip he took was to the U.S. and he did not go first to the White House. He went first to California. Thanks students in the UC system who were forced to divestment of $3 billion worth of stock. He said, we liberated ourselves, but we could not have done it without you. It was Mandela's great accomplice, Desmond Tutu, who asked us, one of the voices rising up to ask for divestment from fossil fuels. He said last year, if you could see the drought and the famine plaguing Africa as a result of climate change, even though we burn less than 1% of fossil fuel on the planet, you would understand why I have asked you to take up these tools again. Point 8, divestment is not, as Christian points out correctly, the only strategy we need. We're grateful to him for reminding us of that. We try to be cognizant of it. 350.org has spearheaded the fight on Keystone. It's helped battle coal ports to prevent the flow of coal, as Jim points out, overseas, works on mountaintop removal, Arctic drilling. Our activists demand renewable portfolio standards, net metering, and the subsidies for fossil fuel, and the reinvestment of divestment money, all sorts of good things. And of course, we're part of the only group that work in this. Groups like Sierra Club just announced huge plans to fight for just the kind of fleet purchases and things that Christian recommends. It is a strong movement, and it needs to be, because it is up against the richest companies on earth. A financial force so powerful that it is very difficult to stand up to them. Just to give you an example, the entire budget of 350.org, which works in 181 countries around the world, with 50 young people on its staff and tens of thousands of volunteers, our budget is less than half of what Duke paid Mr. Rogers last year to be his CEO. Those are the kind of imbalances that we're at work on, which leads me to the final point, point 9. This is why we need universities above all to take stands, to work with us. We need institutions where ideas matter to take on an actual stand. Yes, it's true out there are many sides of every question, but sometimes in the end you actually have to come down and make a decision, take a stand, do a dichotomous thing, speak up for that which you believe. Universities are important because of places like this where we learn the truth about climate change. It's in the research labs, great American universities, that we came to understand the greatest problem that the planet has ever faced. Therefore, it's places like this that carry a special burden to act on it. Beyond that, it's the reputation of places like Brown that make it important. As Tom Steyer, the great investor and leader in this divestment fight, after divesting his own holdings from fossil fuel, as he said, speaking to college trustees, your decision one way or another on this matter is a statement of who you are as a college, what your mission is. A strong and well-defined mission is an incredibly valuable thing for a college or any institution. Your mission is your advantage, and you have to decide whether that includes
cooperating with people doing apartheid in South Africa, whether it includes cooperating with the forces of the warming the world, so on and so forth. The final reason that it is so important that universities do this is that there is no place where the intergenerational dilemma posed by climate change is more important. Most of the time in universities like this one or the one I work, the basic model is old people teach young people things. Okay? And that's appropriate. The idea is that we've acquired some wisdom and passed it along. But in this case, that logic is turned on its head in many ways. Most of us will be dead before the worst of climate change completely kicks in. But for people coming of age now, if we do not tackle this problem and tackle it with far, far more ferocity than our government, Duke, or anybody else has shown in taking this on, then the lives of those young people will be dramatically reduced and degraded as their lives wear on. By the time that they should be in the prime of their careers, much of their work, as the scientists tell us, will be devoted to nothing but emergency response to the kind of ongoing horror that we see around us more and more all the time. And so this is one of the cases where people of the age of those in the administration or on the board of trustees need to defer to the need, the desire, and the well-educated demand of younger people to do the right thing, and not to do it sometime down the future, to do it now. Thanks.